Thank you, Nick, and I appreciate everyone taking time out of their day. And Marlene, I appreciate you too. I'm in right outside Philadelphia too, on the east side of Pennsylvania. So I'm by Villanova. So I can't quite see you, but I'll wave in that direction. Right, you're over there. So it's good to have you on here today. And thanks everyone at the at the Community Foundation here for bringing me in. And I do a lot of speaking, and it is very different. I know when Nick and I talked about this a while ago now, I was planning on coming out there, and then obviously the world's changed, and so we will, and that's probably not breaking news to anyone at this point, right? But we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is, thanks for doing kind of the introduction for me. The other thing is I tend to tell people just a little bit about me personally too. It's nice to humanize me, as I'm kind of at this point I don't know, I feel like a little bit of a retirement robot, because I just go on Zooms all day and talk about retirement plan provisions and tax laws. But I am a father and husband, and I've got 3 young children who are at the house still now, right, with the world's being changed. So it is possible any one of those 3 could make a surprise appearance. And my dog is here too. He's about a 95-pound Labradoodle. He's on his back sleeping behind me. But if I get too excited, sometimes he gets excited in these too. So let me now just kind of go over like what we're going to talk about here. And the main thing is we're going to talk about kind of trends, right? What's happening this year. I'll cover the Secure Act, the CARES Act in this presentation. There's pieces of different acts in here too, but those really being the main 2 that really within the last 9 months have reshaped a lot of the tax laws, a lot of the rules that we have to follow when we talk about retirement planning. Now, obviously, COVID's been a huge impact on the world, the United States, and on our financial planning. It's been a huge impact for foundations and charities and individuals, right? It's a very different and challenging time, as we heard, like right even before hopping on this. Last year I did about 200 nights in hotels, and I really haven't left my house, right, since March 13th, which was that Friday when everything started shutting down. So, very different, right? It's just a challenging time. So I'll talk a little bit about trends here, and I will just kind of forewarning to people. I get excited. I talk fast. That's that Northeastern. I'm an attorney by trade, so all of that funnels in here. If at any point, right, you have questions, the chat box, write them down. I'm happy to handle any type of question you come up with. Whether I have the right answer or not, I'll be happy to at least take a shot at it, and try to make this as enjoyable as possible. And again, if I fly through something and at the end of this you want to go back to anything, just let us know. I'm here to help out today. So the first part here is just recognizing what happened this year from kind of an economic standpoint, right? We had a worldwide pandemic occur, and it shifted markets, it shifted economies, it shifted how we behave. Right now, all of a sudden, we're in Zoom everywhere. And part of this, we saw in the stock market, which was up and down, lots of volatility, especially through, March, April into May. And then we really did see more of that V-shaped recovery, at least in the S&P side. But this was the fastest, right, down and up we've ever seen from, bear to bull. We've never seen anything like that. And we had amazingly, through kind of where volatility has smoothed out a little bit, we had 74 daily market swings of at least 1%. I think that it basically from February till August 1st. And I think that's wild, because that really means that there were 74 different breaking news headlines just about the market, right? This is what happens. New information was coming out. People were reacting to it. So whether it was government spending, the CARES Act, right, the market kept reacting. Now things have flattened off a little bit with volatility in the market, which is generally a good thing, right? Lots of volatility gets people worried. Now, looking ahead, that's one thing that occurred. COVID's occurring. We have a big unemployment risk that's still being discussed, right? The government reacted fairly quickly, at least from that aspect of things, passed the CARES Act, new federal unemployment. Well, that has since, for the most part, gone away. There's a smaller system there, but we still have close to, 30 plus million people, kind of unemployed right now due to the changes. So that's a scary kind of macro issue, because that impacts a lot of other things. things. We have less tax revenue coming in now, right? Government hasn't changed its spending. So you're definitely spending more now from a government standpoint than we're bringing in. Well, that starts to have impacts on other things, especially in the retirement world, right? Social Security. We're going to keep hearing stories about the funding status of Social Security, as a lot of things are going on and impact that. And, that is a system that's crucial to America's retirement, but does need changes. We're also in a low interest rate environment with the Fed just last week coming out and saying, right, it might be to 2024 before they want to raise rates. That's a challenge for lots of individuals, right? CDs and bonds, where a lot of Americans like getting their retirement income and return from. It's a challenging marketplace. Foundations, retirement plan, pension plans, a lot of them will struggle in this low interest rate environment. And so that will cause some human behavior changes on what people do from an investment standpoint. And so these are really big macro issues, right? Like these are things that, that are occurring that as an individual, I can't really move and change, but we've got to keep paying attention to them. Now here, I would just kind of mention what's been happening from a regulatory standpoint. So I'm going back to the end of 2019, which now feels like a decade ago, right? In December 2019, in the financial planning and retirement world, there was a bill that was passed called the CARES Act, right? Oh, CARES Act was this year, Secure Act was passed at the end of 2019, setting every community up for Retirement Enhancement Act. And it sounds fantastic, right? When you hear that, you're like, wow, that's really good. Setting every community up for retirement enhancement. And Congress did a great job. And essentially, that was almost a unanimous bill passage, too. And I have a friend who works in DC, and he says, I'm always as concerned about bills where everyone in Congress signs off on it as I am when, right, it's one party, right? So he's like, I'm just as concerned about both of those. So this bill that said setting every community up for retirement enhancement was what at its core? It was actually a tax revenue bill. It was a positive tax revenue bill, meaning what? It was increasing taxes in some way. But it sounds really nice, but it was a tax revenue bill at its core. And so I'll go through some of the big changes that occurred with that. And it's mostly about, right, the ability to leave our retirement accounts to our children, our heirs, and the taxes that will now occur. Then fast forward to March, we got the CARES Act in response to COVID-19, which is essentially the biggest spending bill we've seen in 50, 60 years from the government, right? Trying to keep the economy afloat, trying to keep individuals moving forward, trying to hold things together. And honestly, from an economic standpoint, it's done a lot of that. It's kept people moving forward in a very challenging time. Now, I have down there like the next stimulus bill. People still expect something. I'm not in the, I don't try to make my living off of predicting what the government's going to do. I don't think, you'd have a very challenging life if that was a goal, but there is still an expectation out there. We're going to get another bill sometime. And again, that time frame, just unknown. There's one that made it through the House called the HEALS Act, but a version of that's been kicked around in the Senate, but that hasn't kind of moved all the way forward yet. So the reality is, I know a lot of you, you give back. And part of this, is just how are people feeling today? And the reality is people, sometimes I use a black and white photo. It actually makes her look sadder. But, people are concerned. They're concerned about a lot of things, right? Longevity, healthcare, being able to just spend time with family. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about running out of money. There's a lot of concerns out there. So from when we think about a planning standpoint, like how do you move people from concerned at least about finances? And generally it's part of it's fairly simple. And I just try to hit this message that it's about planning. That planning and setting goals tends to allow people to visualize what will occur, where they're going, and it actually creates a sense of ease in your mind, which is why it's so important, right? Whether you're running a business, your personal life, a foundation, right? That you engage in some level of active planning, right? That's really the core. And to be honest, the details of it are all going to be individualized. Right. So like I'll tell you a bunch of planning strategies here throughout this, but some of them will apply to you, some won't. But the core is we need a plan. So the next part is I talk about a lot here in retirement income planning, and I'm going to kind of take a step back and talk about, right, the planning process, what goes into it, and how I tend to describe this to people. So the firm that I am associated with and work with, we provide financial planning to roughly 34,000 American households, which is a lot. And so this type of process is used to benefit many, many people out there in the country. But it is about following a process. I tend to use the language that process and planning creates a blueprint for success. It doesn't guarantee a success, but it helps us down that path. So when we talk about income planning, right, we get to retirement and what has to happen? Marlene and David and everyone on here, right? All of a sudden, all this savings, right? All the stuff that you and your spouse worked for, right? That has to provide us income now, right? Our working days of providing our income shifts. So we move from this where we work and we create our income to we rely on Social Security and pensions, 401k, IRAs, income sources. And it is a fundamental shift. And I think still people downplay how big of a shift that is, like how challenging it is in retirement to shift from where my husband and I or spouse and I worked, and then all of a sudden we're not working and generating income from other sources. That is a tremendous shift. And so I try to describe it like hitting a moving target in the wind. And so what is the target? The target is whatever you want to accomplish. So that could be your charitable goals. It could be travel. It could be where you want to live. If you wanted to play golf, if you want to spend time with grandkids, whatever that goal is unique to you. And that kind of creates our target. Now, I say that target is moving. Why is it moving? Does anyone here know exactly how long they're going to be in retirement, right? We don't know that. We can take educated guess around how long we're going to live, but we actually don't have a great gauge on that, right? So could we be in retirement for 5 years, 10 years, or 40 years, right? If you're alive at 65, can you live to 105? Of course you can, right? So all of a sudden we could have a 40-year, right, retirement. Right? That's a tremendously long period of time. And we've got to kind of prepare for that. What happens? So my great-grandmother lived to 103. And when she was 100, my grandfather always tells this story and I retell it. She called him and said, hey, I want to make sure, like, am I okay financially? Like, do I have enough money? And he goes, yeah, Mom, you're totally fine. You've got enough money for another 15 years. She's 100 years old. And she goes, what the hell am I going to do after that? And so she was alive at 100 and all of a sudden thinking, right, yeah, another 15 years. I'm not planning on going anywhere. She did live a couple more years, right? So that mindset of once you start getting later into retirement, right, you don't want to be running out of money. You don't want to think, hey, in 5-10 years, I'm going to be out of money, right? Nobody wants to run out of money before they pass away. Now, the next part here is wind, right? So we've got the target. It's moving because of longevity. And then there's wind. And I think wind's probably the easiest one to see this year, which is, 2020 probably counts as wind. It's all those things that could blow us off course. And, that's public policy risk. It's COVID-19. It's inflation. It's market risk. All of these different things come into play. And we can't expect in retirement to, go from day one, right? And then go all the way through retirement and expect it to be the exactly same. It's going to be different. Things are going to come up that we've never thought about. And as I say, I wrote a book for Forbes maybe 6 years ago on retirement risks, and we didn't have global pandemic in there, right? That wasn't something that we wrote out as a retirement risk. Well, fast forward, a couple years and here we are. And that's a real retirement risk. And so our planning is, right, trying to take those goals, those risks, put them together to make a person feel more secure that they're not going to run out of money and they're going to be able to accomplish their goals. Now, as I know, I'm doing kind of a lot of setup, and then we will get into some of the more detailed changes that occurred this year. But this stuff's important, right? Because we need to know where the details fit in. So then the next part I go into is what are the kind of philosophies or approaches to income planning? And generally speaking, there are 3 main approaches out there in the world. We have what I call safety first, systematic withdrawal, and then a bucketing approach. So safety first approach to retirement is saying, well, let's figure out what our mandatory expenses are, right? What do we absolutely have to have that are essential? And that's kind of the building block. It's the core. We have to have those. All the other little things on top of that, they don't really matter if the foundation isn't solid. And so, where do we want our foundation from in retirement? We want to make sure that some level of secure income is coming in. So that's where, honestly, why we have a social security system, right? To provide a floor of income to meet basic expenditures. That also might be why we use CDs or bonds or safer investable assets, cash, right? So we know some level of certainty, especially for our basic expenditures. Now, when we move up the kind of value prop, discretionary expenses, right? The golfing, the giving to charity, things like that, we might be willing to take a little bit more risk with that because, well, we can get by without it. We could cut back. So we're able to invest some of that. We're able to take some risk because the need there isn't as high. And so that's essentially the flooring approach, is figure out what's essential and create safe income to cover those essential expenditures. Now, the next one here, and these buckets kind of move on the slide. I'm not a big graphic person, but one of my teammates made these ones move for these three. So that one moves, and it's kind of showing, look, a bucketing approach is you have different assets, and we're going to use them at different periods of time for retirement. And so maybe the first 5 years we use our very safe assets. And then the next 5 years we have moderate assets, mutual funds that are, 60-40 mixes. And then we leave our equities out further. And in a similar fashion, it's not terribly different than a flooring strategy, but it's saying what years are the most important to you. That the first 5 to 10 years of retirement are the most likely to occur, right? You're most likely to be alive from 65 to 75. And then you're next likely to be alive 75 to 85 to 90. You're less likely to be alive from 90 to 100. So if I'm going to assign where do I want certainty with, I want certainty more on the front end, less on the back end. So I'm able to take more risk long term. That's essentially the underlying assumptions with that approach. People also just like knowing where they're going to spend. Probably all of you do this a little bit, right? Does everyone have a bank account or in your house? I remember this growing up, people would have the pizza jar or vacation jar, right? And you only use that money for a certain thing. We call that mental accounting. And we like to, in our mind, assign money to different areas, right? So people in retirement, like RMDs, I've seen people that use required minimum distributions for a very specific thing. For instance, one of them we'll talk about here later could be for your charitable giving, that you decide that you're going to use, right, the money that comes out of the IRA as a QCD for your charitable giving. That's your charitable giving account. That's okay. It's called mental accounting. It's a form of bucketing, and it's a perfectly reasonable philosophy to use. The next one here is how most people in the financial planning world approach this, which we call systematic withdrawal. This is, if you get down to the details, can be very complex, but in short, you see probably every financial institution you've ever logged into will probably display your investments kind of like this circular chart with different assets. And then people just sell a percent of that to meet their spending goals. Something out there that's pretty popularized since the 1990s has been the 4% rule that they talk about, which was research done by Bill Bengen in the 90s, which said you could send 4% of a portfolio, invested 50% in U.S. large cap and 50% bonds, adjusted for inflation, not run out of money for 30 years. So that became this big retirement planning guideline or rule of thumb. And that's just a form of systematic withdrawal, that we just invest and we sell pieces of the investment to generate our spending. So those are essentially, right, the philosophies. Now, I did hit this already a little bit, but I like hitting some of the numbers around longevity. I still use this term, even though I'm trying to get better on it, which is you'll see this out there in articles. And as I said, myself, I fall into it too. It says longevity risk. The reality is I don't actually think longevity is a risk. Longevity is a really good thing, right? I want to live for as long as possible. Right? That's not a risk. What it really is a risk exacerbator. It exacerbates other risks, right? It increases the likelihood I run out of money. It increases the likelihood, right, that I need long-term care. It increases the risk of inflation. So this creates lots of challenges for our savings because we have to have kind of a certain amount of money, our spending needs every year, for an uncertain period of time. Now, interestingly, right, a lot of people use averages. What's the average kind of life expectancy? And you see the Social Security ones up here, 84, 86 for male and female. But the reality is averages are wrong half the time, right? Half the people live longer than that, and half the people pass away before that. You know, a lot of people are living longer and longer, right? 1 in 3 will live past age 90. If you're alive at 65, you actually, as a couple, are more likely than not to have one person live past age 90. 1 in 7 will live past 95, and people actually tend to underestimate their life expectancy. So I have this one. I just looked at it the other day, which I thought was interesting because I underestimated it. If you're alive at 90, what is the life expectancy according to Social Security? So that's just the average, right? Half the people will live longer and half the people will kind of make it to that age. Interestingly enough, it's almost, almost have 5 years of life expectancy left on average. And I thought that was really interesting because, I think that's a very good perspective that if you had two spouses alive then at 90, there's a really good chance one of them is going to live to 100. So, we still have a long time horizon. We're still talking about 10 plus years here around there for two spouses, which is, just an interesting way to frame it. Most people just underestimate. They don't look at kind of the right way to approach averages. They kind of skew numbers. So anyways, that's a lot of the background, right? So we're kind of frame up my whole idea and philosophies around income planning. Now let's get into, right, some of the win, the things that are occurring this year. So we're going to step back in time, really far back in time, right to the end of 2019. And we were back then worried about the implications of the Secure Act, which, seem, somewhat minor now in light of where we are in the world. This bill had 29 separate provisions. It's the largest tax planning bill in almost 2 decades to pass. I'm going back to kind of 2006-ish time frame, since we've really had a significant change on the retirement rules. Now, there were 3 main goals of this bill. Which were essentially small employer retirement plans, increased lifetime income options, and then a lot of changes around retirement income from required minimum distributions, right? Those forced out accounts, both while alive and after we've passed away. Probably the 3 most important changes for most people come right here. So the required minimum distribution age got pushed out from 70 and a half to 72 for those who had not yet obtained age 70 and a half by the end of 2019. So that moving forward here, right, the new rule is 72. It's not a huge change, but I think that 70 and a half rule was always just kind of bothersome to people, so it adds some clarity. 72 is a lot easier to remember. We can still put money into IRAs if we're still working past 72 and 70 and a half now and deduct them. That's a really good change. It's a common sense change to the rules. Then the next one, which is by far and away the biggest change in the whole Secure Act, which comes around the stretch IRA and 401k rules. A little bit of background on that. The old rules, and we'll get to this here in 2 more slides, was if I left my IRA or my 401k, my retirement account to my kids, to my grandkids, they could take distributions from that account essentially over the course of their own life, which was able to spread out the tax impact and receive tax benefits for decades. It was a very positive piece of planning for many people. That is essentially gone for many, many beneficiaries now. And we've moved to, instead of having 20, 30, 40 years to take distributions, we must take distributions within 10 years. That is a huge tax revenue change for the government because, again, they're going to condense, right, 20, 30 years worth of taxable distributions into a very small period of time, meaning higher taxable distributions, bumping people into higher tax rates. So that is where really the whole core of this tax revenue generation and this tax increase really occurred, is right there. That is the core of this. And to some degree, it almost feels like a hidden tax increase because nobody heard, right? Hey, the Secure Act tax revenue bill. They heard all the other provisions, the other 29 or 28 of the 29, and not, hey, you know what? At the core of this, the government's saying it's tax revenue generating. Now, again, fast forward. So this occurred, and I thought I was going to spend all year just focusing on the Secure Act, right? That's what I'm doing in January. It's what I'm doing in February. Then come March, and the world changed. And we had to switch course pretty fast. We had to start understanding the CARES Act, right, which was in response to the coronavirus, COVID-19, $6 trillion into the economy to keep businesses, unemployment, right, healthcare, markets, all of those things up and floating to help the bond market have liquidity from the Fed. A tremendous amount of moving pieces in here. Now, there were some changes to retirement plans in here. Three main ones that came about. One is a suspension of 2020 RMDs. So those forced distributions, right, after you reach age 70.5 and then 72 because of the Secure Act, they got suspended for this year. Included inherited accounts. That's one that a lot of people are missing, is that if you inherited an account, you actually didn't have to take RMDs for this year. That created a lot of complexity because it passed in March and people already started RMDs. Now, we also added a new distribution exception and some loan provisions. Probably for most people here, those aren't the biggest impacts, but if you're still working, you're in your 30s, 40s, those could be valuable ways to access your retirement plans this year. So now's probably a good time to take a half a breather and see if there were any questions that went in. Nick, do we have anything in yet you want me to pause on? As I know, I warned everyone it's going to be a lot of information, and that's the first chunk. So I will pause for a second here.
Great. I don't have any questions yet in the chat box. Does anyone else have a question or two they'd like to ask?
All right.
Jamie, I'm not hearing anything, so back to you.
So now let's get into, we've really set the stage pretty well now, right? That hopefully we have a good understanding of just the retirement income world, what we're dealing with, and then a lot of the changes that took place. So then I want to spend time on this. So this is a huge piece of things. This is paying attention to what's going to happen to our retirement accounts if we don't spend all of it while we're alive, and also protecting spouses. There's a lot of things going on here. And so, as I said, we're moving from a system that used to allow lifetime distributions to our beneficiaries of our retirement account to many beneficiaries being at a 10-year distribution period. So there's a lot of kind of planning strategies, but one of the big things, right, this is going to increase taxes. Again, I'll show a little quick example of this, but I have further examples if anyone wants to see it. But this is the government's goal here. There's to shorten down the tax benefit time period to increase distributions, increase taxes, wrap these accounts up faster. There's some good reasons for it, but at its core, right, we have to get back to this is a move to increase taxes. So are we looking at the right beneficiary planning, the right trust planning, all of those things to make sure that we're transferring our wealth and protecting our wealth as best as we can, that nobody's required to pay more taxes than they're legally required to pay. So let's make sure that we're not doing that. So here's the new breakdown. This is pretty hard to see because it's a lot of different beneficiaries listed on here, but I will kind of explain this. So here's essentially the new rules. That non-spouse beneficiaries, children, grandchildren, friends, right, they go to 10 years. So once you pass away, within 10 years after the year of death, the entire account must be distributed out, right? That's the biggest change. Now, there are still a bunch of exceptions to the rule. So the main exceptions being kind of down here a little bit further, which is, right, spouse of the deceased owner, right? So you pass away, you can still leave your retirement account to your surviving spouse, and they can stretch out distributions over their own life. So that's really, really good because we're not forcing the spouse who loses their husband or wife, right, to all of a sudden have to distribute this whole retirement account within a couple years. They can still stretch out over their own life expectancy. So that is a good thing. I'm glad that they kept that exception in place. The other one, and there's an asterisk next to it up here, but is minor children of the deceased account owner. And so the asterisk is, yes, minor children are exempt from the 10-year distribution rule, but only until they reach the age of majority. So if you pass away and you leave your 401k to your kid, or and they're 16, well, they might only have 2 more years, and then they have to distribute it within 10 years. So it is still not stretching it over their life, but you get smaller distributions up to the age of majority and then distributed within 10 years. The most important piece about this to also remember, it is children of the owner. It is not grandchildren. It is not just minors. So if you were to leave your retirement account to your grandchild who is 10, that 10-year-old would only have 10 years to distribute the entire account. That's a big problem, right? That's not a good outcome in a lot of these cases. Now, other things, charities, estates, certain trusts, there was a 5-year distribution rule. That's still in place for a lot of them. To be honest, for charities, it's not a huge issue. They're not paying taxes on the distributions of the retirement accounts anyway. So a lot of times, right, charities just liquidate the whole amount, almost as soon as they inherit it. Or if we're using a charitable remainder trust, again, we tend to liquidate the account and move it to the trust that year. So for charities, not a really big impact because the tax concerns aren't there. But if we don't have the right beneficiaries set up and it's getting sent to the estate, that 5-year rule is really burdensome. I'm an attorney. I used to do estate planning. That's a big problem. It's a huge tax liability that at that point is honestly a little bit too late to offset most of it. So here's a really quick example of, kind of just dollars associated with this. I actually have this example, it broken out in another presentation. It goes on for like 10 pages actually to show the tax implications. But I've kind of decided that that's probably too much information. It's just good to show highlight the top end of it. So here I have 75-year-old, let's say they pass away, and they leave their IRA with $1 million to their 45-year-old child. Under the old rules, right, prior to this year, right, that child would have about 40 years to distribute that $1 million. Meaning if you took that and divided it out, you'd get around this $25,000 a year. Versus now, it would be about $100,000 a year if you levelized it over the 10 years. Now, the important thing to think about here is this is exactly where the taxes are going to come from. If you add $100,000 of taxable income onto almost anyone's tax rate, what happens? Where do you think you go in tax brackets if you have another $100,000 of income? Yeah, you go up. If you get 25,000, you might not go up to the next tax bracket. But if you get 100,000, you're almost certain to go up to a new tax rate. So what this is doing by condensing the distribution period is going to subject these dollars to higher taxes. Now, here's the other question. Think about who tends to be passing away and who tends to be, right, the children, the one inheriting something of somebody passing away. Here I've got 75-45, but it could be 85-55. 45-year-olds, 55-year-olds, where are they in their work careers? Are they in their highest or lowest earning years of their life? Right? Well, 55-year-olds are hopefully earning probably about as much money as they've ever earned, meaning that they're also probably in the highest tax bracket they've ever been in. And they're the ones inheriting this now having higher income tacked on top of it versus the 75, 85, 95-year-old who just passed away, who's probably in about the lowest tax bracket they've ever been in. So this is a huge tax shift from that retiree, right, away from them to a high earner, right, increasing the amount of distributions and moving them up in a tax rate. That's the challenge with all of this. So this is a huge issue out there right now. And right, this is brand new. We actually haven't even essentially fully gotten this in place because the rules start this year in 2020. The first distributions will actually start in 2021 under those rules. But we're there now. Those are the rules that we're living under. Now, here's another huge issue, and I've worked with a lot of attorneys and trust departments on this one. A lot of individuals use trusts as beneficiaries of their retirement accounts. And so this one is really important. So if I kind of try to grab everyone's attention here, right, it's like that reset. Can I have your attention, please? Right? If you're using a trust, which a lot of people do, revocable living trusts, as part of your estate plan, and you probably talked to an attorney, and the attorney said, well, we set this up, it helps protect, it helps manage the assets, and we can send your retirement accounts there too, and we can even draft this in a way that it qualifies as a pass-through trust, and you can receive the stretch benefits. Great. That was planning that's been done for the last 30 years. Well, the Secure Act passed, and it actually made a lot of that, right, not work so well. So here's the issue. A lot of those trusts have language, and I just have this quote right here, the second bullet point, that says beneficiaries will have access to the required minimum distributions of the IRA or retirement account each year. Okay. Well, that sounds good. And that was really the language that we had to use to qualify for the stretch provisions previously, to allow our beneficiaries to stretch out these tax benefits. Well, now when we apply that to the new rules, it creates a really big challenge. And what is that challenge? The Secure Act says the entire account must be distributed within the 10th year following the year of death of the owner. So it means you die this year, and your beneficiary has to deplete the entire account by the end of the 10th year. Well, there is no required minimum distribution now for year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The only year that the law requires a distribution is by the end of the 10th year. Now, here's where this creates the challenge is we go back and read these trust documents, and it says you have access to the required minimum distribution each year. What is the year one required minimum distribution? It's $0. The next year, 0, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, they're all zeros, which means all of a sudden you pass away, you leave your IRA to your trust, which the attorney 5 years ago, last year said is a great way to do it. The money gets tied up for 10 years. The kids have absolutely no access to it for 10 years. Think about how happy people are when you try to keep their money from them. They're really, really excited about that. It's always the best thing, right? Just imagine, right? Losing your loved one, thinking you have access to this money, going in, and the attorney or the bank saying, oh, sorry, we can't distribute any of this until 2031, right? Imagine that today, saying, right, in the challenging year that we're having right now, being told that you have no access to this. Maybe you just out of pocket paid for a lot of the funeral expenses and medical expenditures, and they're saying no money for 10 years. Now, here's the other downside of that. All the money would then be distributed in one tax year, meaning that $1 million example before would all come out in one tax year. Well, what happens to that? Well, your effective tax rate is now like 40%. All right. We just lost a ton of that because we couldn't spread it out over numerous years. So I was back in January and late December saying this is my single biggest concern about the changes here for the rules, because what it means is we have to go and review all these trust documents. Now, not every single trust document has that language. Sometimes they have other bits of language, but the reality is the rules changed substantially at the end of last year. And if you were using a trust to be the beneficiary of your retirement assets, it absolutely needs to be reviewed this year, right? Because this is a planning disaster. To have the money locked up for 10 years and then all distributed in one taxable year is not good planning. It's probably not your goal. It's not your intention, but the rules change. And so I've been, I don't know if you say on the warpath or whatever, but I've been kind of hitting on this one a lot because this is a huge issue out there. And I don't want people's families to, end up in this situation due to lack of planning. So I'm going to skip this one here. And let's talk then about some of the strategies out there to kind of mimic the stretch. So that being how do we get back to those positive tax benefits that we had prior to the passage of the Secure Act? So there's a lot. Rolling over the accounts to the surviving spouse. We could use annuity contracts, and everyone has their opinion on annuities. Roth conversions, getting money into Roth accounts. Roth accounts work pretty well now under this 10-year period, because on the flip side, I can now leave my Roth account if I wanted through the whole 10-year period, let it grow tax-free, then take distributions. Again, maybe you don't want to, but it does give us that planning flexibility, and there are benefits to it. We'll talk about IRAs to charitable remainder trusts. I think that's probably one of the more beneficial things for this group to hear, because we're talking about, right, community foundation planning, charitable giving. That's a really important piece of this. So a lot of different strategies out there. One of them, as I said, is just the spousal rollover, right? Do you want to leave your account to your surviving spouse because they can stretch it out? That works a lot of times. There are times after the Secure Act, we actually might want to split up accounts, between the kid and the surviving spouse to give the child beneficiary a 10-year distribution period when spouse one dies, and then give them a new 10-year distribution period when spouse two passes away. So in fact, all this really did from a planning standpoint is create really more complexity. I would say this is just more complex. There isn't a right or wrong answer, but there are more things to consider than before. Again, this just means, right, a lot of the estate planning, a lot of the beneficiary designation planning just needs to be reviewed again. Roth conversions are probably my favorite thing to talk about. I don't have a ton in here on that, but what's the benefit of a Roth account? It's very much like our traditional IRA, but it grows tax-free as long as we meet certain conditions. And one of the benefits of this right now is typically the decision to do tax-deferred or Roth is, do you expect higher taxes in the future? And all of a sudden now, if we start looking out at this beneficiary planning and we see our children being subject to higher taxes, it actually starts making sense to convert some of these accounts while alive. So under the new Secure Act distribution rules, it would then pay taxes sooner rather than later at our children's higher tax rates during a condensed time period. So tax diversification, conversions, all of this is very beneficial. It does require, again, individualized planning. We have to know your tax situation, but I don't run into very many people either that believe tax rates are going down in the future anymore. I think pretty much everyone says, hey, I think tax rates are going to be higher. So then when should you pay your taxes, today or wait for rates to be higher? And that's really just an answer that you probably should think about personally. So I'm going to hop over here. Let's talk about this one. So using charitable remainder trusts. Charitable remainder trusts to some degree sound complex, right? If you've all been around the community foundation, so hopefully you've heard some of this before. But we have a whole bunch of variations in these. Now, let me try to make this as simple as possible. I know I've a lot of information, but charitable remainder trusts, and we're going to think about this with regards to our retirement account, our IRA, as the beneficiary. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to say when we pass away, we're going to leave our IRA to a charitable remainder trust. And this charitable remainder trust is then going to make payments to our designed beneficiary, our spouse, our kids, for the course of their life. And then the remainder of it is going to go to, right, the charity. And so what's the benefit of this, right? Like, so, okay, I have a visual here that will show this. So trying to boil it down as simple as possible. IRA goes to the charitable remainder trust. Charitable remainder trust then makes payments to somebody for life for up to 20 years. Remainder goes to the charity. Well, let me show you an example here now under the new rules. So let's say we have that $1 million IRA, and we decide that we do want to give to charity. We're a charitable inclined person, and we want to provide some lifetime income to our child. Maybe we don't even really trust them with the $1 million of a lump sum in an IRA. So we want to provide income to life. We want to give to the charity. We want to maximize our wealth, right, as much as we can, right? And so basic idea is let's think about leaving this to the charitable remainder trust. And here we use a bunch of assumptions, right? So this is an example. It's not what happens in every case, but we've got a 50-year-old, a tax growth rate of 6%. You could argue high or low, but probably somewhat reasonable, 5 to 6%. Tax rates using the ones that we have in place today. So this is, there's 6 up here, but actually I always try to focus, kind of bring focus down to 2 or 3. So one of the things is, all right, what happens? How much will we leave to the family and the charity? So the total net that we would leave after tax to the family and charity, what's the best strategy? Well, the bright green one, kind of right in the middle, that was if we had a stretch IRA. Going back to the old rules, and I just left it to my kids, the 50-year-old, it did really well. That was really, really preferential treatment. Well, that's gone now. So our goal is, how can we get back to something close to that? Now, the blue kind of in the middle, I guess it's a blue, I don't know, teal maybe color, ocean blue, at least up here. That's the 10-year rule. It's a lot less. It's significantly less if we just leave it. They distribute it over 10 years, right? Almost 25% less in this example. Now, how do we get back above that? We use the charitable remainder trust. And because we essentially are getting this tax play of some portion of the money going to the charity and some portion going to the income beneficiary, we actually see that the charitable remainder annuity trust, the CRAT, will actually outperform in this scenario, even just leaving the full amount to, right, as a 10-year by significant portions. So the thing about this is a viable solution now. It's a viable solution if you want to give to charity and provide income to, right, your beneficiary, that we could actually leave more true wealth to them than by just leaving the accounts outright. This is a huge planning opportunity. I would say this is probably one of the biggest planning opportunities we've ran into this year. We have set up a lot of charitable remainder trusts as beneficiaries because we're not shortchanging the kids and the family members. We're actually enhancing benefits in some cases and giving to charity at the same time. And you're like, well, how do you get both? Essentially, what is occurring is you're shifting some of the money that would otherwise go to taxes, right, to the charity and to the beneficiary. That's essentially at its core what is occurring here, but this is an incredibly powerful strategy. Now, you can use charitable remainder trust while you're alive. However, you can't shift your IRA to them. You could take the money out, then give it. But using it as a estate planning tool with your retirement accounts is very beneficial now under this new 10-year rule. So that got a huge boost. Now, again, this requires a lot of planning, right? It requires understanding, why do I want to give? How do I want to give? What do I want to provide for as my legacy to my heirs? It requires a lot of proactive planning, but it's incredibly valuable and important. So really, really kind of crucial piece of planning. I'm going to hop over here and hit the 2020 required minimum distribution waiver from the CARES Act now. And then I've got one more piece on charitable giving I want to hit. So main thing here, CARES Act suspended almost all 2020 required minimum distributions, IRAs, 401ks, inherited accounts, and no need to make that up in the future. Now, up until the end of August, we had the ability to repay these. And if we took out early distributions, say January, February, we could put them back in and not have it treated as a distribution. And right now, it's going to be a little bit harder. Any other distributions we take this year could potentially be repaid under the 60-day rollover rule, but is a lot harder to do at this point. So that's a big change for 2020. So if you haven't taken RMDs yet, you run into people that are around you that haven't done this yet. A lot of people wait to December. I think, hopefully lots of people have heard this. I still run into people every week, email me and ask me a question about RMDs. The inherited account one is a big one that people just kind of get wrong. Inherited accounts don't have RMDs for this year either, but they're very hard to fix. We don't have that same 60-day rollover opportunity. So not taking out the money if we don't need it this year is a good strategy. So again, another really big change from the CARES Act. So this last part here, I want to hit a couple charitable distribution changes that occurred too. So QCDs, qualified charitable distributions, one of the most powerful ways to give directly from our retirement account, right, to a qualified charity. So giving in 2020, again, right, it's actually a very challenging year for giving, right? Charities know this, right? Foundations, everyone's kind of aware of this. Tax Cut and Job Act also reduced some of the incentives to give because it's harder to itemize now. So less people are getting a tax benefit from their kind of smaller amounts of giving. Now, there's a lot of things going on, right? There is, for a lot of people, unemployed or less income this year, right? Less likely, right, that you're going to get a significant tax deduction if your income's lower or your tax rates are lower. So there are reasons to maybe defer giving, which for charities isn't necessarily great, right, as we look at cash flow. Other times it might be a good year to bunch contributions a little bit earlier. And I love this next one because I was talking to one of my friends and they always bring this up, right? Charitable giving spreads. It's contagious like yawns, right? Not contagious like a bad thing, but we see it and we react to it. So when we can get this in front of people, we can talk about planning. When you can go and say, hey, I did a QCD or I set up a charitable remainder trust, that spreads. Other people then want to see it. And we start with the why, right? You have to be charitably inclined. You want to have an impact. Give impactfully, give efficiently is what I tend to say. And so what we want to do is start with the why are we giving? How much do we want to give? Do we have the means to give? Are we ready to give? And then we can get to the efficient versus inefficient. Some of that can be around bunching. Bunching's probably been the top kind of talk of the town since Tax Cut and Job Act passed, which was, should we condense our giving into singular years or spread it out over many years? And so this example I have here actually kind of does both. It's leveraging donor advised funds, which again, a great community foundation that we're here on the call for can help with, right? Running one of those. So we can use a donor advised fund to bunch contributions. And what do I mean by that? So Tax Cut and Job Act, right, passed the end of 2017, essentially doubled the standard deduction and removed a bunch of itemized deductions, which we went from about a third of the country filing as itemized filers to less than 10%, meaning a lot of people are not getting a tax benefit in the way that they're giving to charitable organizations because they can't get above the standard deduction to itemize. So there's no tax benefit. So here's a good example of that. I've got John and Mary Doe making $10,000 a year in gifts to a charity. They've got another $14,000 of itemized deductions each year. They get up right to around $24,000, but it doesn't exceed the standard deduction. So they get no tax value from their charitable giving, even though, right, over a 3-year period, they gave $30,000. Well, this is a person that's charitably inclined. They figured out the why. They're trying to make the impact, but they're giving inefficiently. They're paying more taxes than they're legally required to pay because they didn't do any planning. So really what they could consider is saying, hey, let's go to our favorite donor advised fund here at the Community Foundation, set that up. We're still going to give to the same charity that we were giving. We're still going to give $10,000 a year, but I'm going to write that check all this year in 2020 for $30,000. And the amazing thing with donor advised funds is the rules allow us to take that full tax deduction this year. So I get a $30,000 itemized deduction plus the other 14 that I had, which puts me up right to $44,800 of itemized. I now essentially have a $20,000, right, additional deduction that I was otherwise never going to get over the next 3 years. What did I do? I bunched my contributions in this year, and I can still send the money to the same charity. And I can still have $10,000 a year plus now the investment gains inside the donor advised fund go to that charity each year. It saves me in their tax situation $7,000 additional dollars based on their 35% rate at $20,000. $7,000 by giving more efficiently. I didn't do anything else. I gave the same amount of money, but I gave it in a more efficient manner. Well, I could do anything with that $7,000, right? I could spend it on my retirement. I've now improved, right, my retirement by $7,000 over a 3-year period. I could also give that back to charity, right? If I wanted to give more, that could be the case. So very powerful by just looking at this stuff and making sure that we have a plan. Going back to the beginning, if we don't have a plan, right, we're going to, right, plan to fail. So is right now the good time to give? Well, it just depends, right? It depends on your situation. There's a lot of valuable things out there to consider when it comes to giving, right? Different strategies, but it's not always the case for everyone. Now, last thing I want to hit on this, then we'll kind of look forward and wrap up, and I'll answer a couple questions here. Qualified charitable distributions, QCDs, very powerful gifting strategy directly from your IRA to a charitable organization, 501c3, right? And it does not show up as taxable income at all, and it offsets required minimum distributions up to $100,000 a year. That's a very, very powerful strategy. It's one of the most efficient ways to give because essentially it's 100% dollar for dollar from income being wiped out from, right, essentially the charitable deduction. Now, if you were a standard filer and you wanted to do $5,000, you might not get above that standard deduction. Here, you could get the full amount of the $5,000, right, not showing up as taxable income by sending it directly from the IRA to the charity. So this you can do as soon as you reach age 70 and a half directly from the IRA. Now, the one main thing to mention here is, look, RMDs are not owed now in 2020. So does it make sense for some people to say, you know, I use that in part to offset the required minimum distributions? So should you pause on the QCD this year and actually wait till next year and maybe double up your gifting to offset more of the RMD? And you could do that in January, right? Because I know that all charities out there are saying, well, we really do want this money. We don't necessarily want it pushed off too far. So if you are trying to give, you're trying to have that impact, maybe just pushing between now or December to January, doubling it up or increasing it to offset some of the RMDs next year could be a beneficial and more efficient way to give. And again, that's an open question, but it is a strategy that is now on the table that wasn't just 6 months ago, right? That is a new thing to consider. So two other small changes that occurred this year as part of the CARES Act, $300 above the line, meaning you don't have to itemize cash deduction amount. So that's fairly small, but for the micro givers, that does save you a little bit of money in taxes that you can take a deduction. And a lot of churches, a lot of schools rely on, 50, 100, $75 gifts. And so that will allow a deduction for those. Now, above that, again, if you're not itemizing, you're not getting a tax benefit. We did allow from the rule changes up to 100% of adjusted gross income in cash gifts in 2020 to now be possible for an itemized deduction. That's typically we don't want to hit 100%. It was 50% before Tax Cut and Job Act, then 60%. Now it's up to 100% for this year. But this can be used effectively in retirement planning. We could do Roth conversions and offset those with a large charitable donation and give us that really big deduction. Maybe we sold a business back at the beginning of the year, right, in January, February, and it's a good year to make a large charitable, right, donation to offset those high taxes associated with a large tax event, like selling a business. So some of those things are out there on the table this year, right, as we had new changes. And these are pretty temporary, right? These are literally from March to the end of the year, so very small time frame to take advantage of. So looking forward, a couple things to just keep considering here, right? So there's a lot of pressure out there, if you hear from this, right, on tax revenue. Right, the government spent $6 trillion to keep the government and kind of budget and everything afloat here for the economy. And that's going to put continued pressure on tax revenue. We definitely have some early retirement risks this year, right, which increases that longevity risk exacerbator. We've got huge issues with trusts and beneficiaries that we have to review. And I think if you take anything away, that's one of probably the two main things to take away is we have to be doing reviews of those things. And a lot of people just frankly aren't. Right. Roth planning, tax diversification is huge, and managing, right, our charitable giving under these new rules. A lot of new valuable strategies that are more valuable than they were even just a year ago, like using charitable remainder trusts, donor advised funds. And then just keep planning for the win, the changes, right? Don't expect that this is the end of anything, right? We're going to see more legislation. We're going into a new, right, election cycle. And then when we come out of that, right, there'll be new policy changes again in 2021, right? We're going to see more change. That'll continue to occur. So make sure that we have the plan and process in place that can handle the win, that can handle the changes as we move forward. So I know that's a tremendous amount of information, and I've been about an hour now talking. So Nick, I'll kick it back over to you here. And I know I saw at least one bubble come up. I don't know if that was a question, but we got a great info. That's good. Thank you, Kathy.
Great. Jamie, thank you so much. This is a lot of good information. You packed a lot into an hour, so we appreciate it. And so, yeah, I'll open it up here for a second for anyone on the call who has a question or two about the material you just learned about.
Jim, could you go through just quickly again the conduit trust beneficiary issue? You mentioned that the situation where nobody could draw for 10 years. I didn't quite follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me, I can slide back over to that. I do have some more in-depth slides on that, so I could send you something, but I will walk through that here again. So the first part is probably starting with the understanding of what the Secure Act says with regards to the new distribution rules. So if this helps, it's, we got to start with the rule. And the rule says, right, the entire retirement account must be distributed by the end of the 10th year following the year of death. So meaning somebody dies this year, right, by the end of 2030, the entire account means to be distributed. That's the new rule. Now, that's brand new, right? That just went into effect this year. Now, almost all of these trusts were written prior to this year. And the trust language was working under the stretch provisions, which said each year you take the account, you divide it by the life expectancy of the oldest trust beneficiary, and that's your required minimum distribution each year. So what the trusts typically have in there is language like this quote: that beneficiaries will only have access to the required minimum distributions of the IRA or 401k each year, right, under the trust. Now, that's the language in the trust. So if we take that language and now apply it today, trust gets the IRA, you pass away. You then go, okay, what's my access point as a beneficiary? I have access to the required minimum distribution each year. Well, what is the minimum distribution that is required each year under the 10-year rule? Well, there is no required distribution in year one. Why? Because it only needs to come out by the end of the 10th year. So I don't have to take anything out this year. Now, that's a good thing if I inherited the IRA directly because I have flexibility. The bad thing is my trust gives me no access because the required minimum distribution this year is technically zero. So I have access to the RMD, which is $0. And then year two, it's $0. Year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 will all be zero required distributions. The only year there is a required distribution will be the 10th year, which means year 10, under the trust language, I would get access to the required distribution for the 10th year, which is now 100% of the remaining trust assets, which is everything. So the problem with that language is it worked under the old rules when we did have required distributions each year. It doesn't work today because I don't have a distribution required until the 10th year. Now, that can be fixed fairly easily. I've actually gone to the notion of saying use HEMS, health, education, maintenance, support. It's very easy. Almost every attorney already has language that they can drop in a trust, or a 5 and 5 power. So give them 5% of the trust assets each year, and a HEMS. Well, that'll pretty much help you distribute over a 10-year period if you want, right? So, and that's, to me, very simple because every single attorney has those already, right? They don't have to draw up new stuff. They don't have to get creative. They can use 2 clauses that have worked to give distribution from trusts for, right, decades. And it's a very easy solution. But if I've, worked on multiple trusts where that's the only access point, and that's a huge problem. And health education maintenance support might not function well enough by itself. I was on a call once with an individual earlier this year, and he said, well, what if they want to take out $30,000 to go on vacation? And I said, well, does your kid go on $30,000 vacations today? And they said, of course not. They don't have any money. And I said, well, then they can't use a HEMS to go on $30,000 vacation because it's maintaining your current standard of living. So they wouldn't have that access there. That's why I like adding the 5% access too in these trust provisions. Does that help?
That helps. That helps. Thank you.
Great question. Any other questions for Jamie?
So, hi, Jamie. This is Kathy. My question was the same as Dave's. I just wanted to really lock down that I'm understanding that the worst possible situation is to have someone who has this trust language and doesn't revisit it, and then surprise, your heirs now have a problem. But if you do not have a trust, if it was just the standard, I'm giving 50% of my IRA to my kid, you're still okay, but the inheritor now no longer has the provision for stretching it over their lifetime. They now do it over 10 years.
Yeah, that was a fantastic recap. So you did pay attention, Kathy. I'm really proud of you. Yeah, and so the worst case is if we were using a trust and we don't revisit it, right? You said that in a fantastic way. The next side is if we're splitting it up 50-50 between 2 kids or grandkids, whoever
Right.
the beneficiary is, then the question is, right, is that still like efficient in the way that we want it to work?
Right.
Or should we be looking at something like a charitable remainder trust? Because if our goal is lifetime income to them, we could increase the dollars that we give lifetime income by using a charitable remainder trust. And I feel like that's been a hard concept to get to people, which is why I show those numbers, because you think, well, no, if I use a charitable remainder trust, they'll still get less money.
Yeah.
Well, that's not necessarily the case under the new rules. So it is something that, like, then, maybe we're still good 5 years and 50-50 and they get 10 years. Okay. That might still be our answer.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And I think, the challenge for us is, I was peppering Nick with questions while you were talking about this, because I think, I'm sitting here thinking about my 85-year-old mother who, she's like, I have this all figured out. Don't make me think about this again. And, how do you approach this to people, with people that are older, who may have felt, I already had all this resolved. How do you reopen that conversation?
Yeah. So one of the things that I built that actually literally just won an award is I built a simple calculator that showed the tax impact of the 10-year versus the stretch. And so all it does, it's actually, I think it's still up on securermd.com. It's just a free calculator. And it just shows the tax impact of a 10-year provision versus the old stretch one. And so the whole purpose of that was just to say, well, you have these much higher distributions. You probably should revisit this. And people go, okay, yeah, it looks like that's really different, right? Because if you get into all these details, right, like it starts going, that seems really complex. And you almost, anytime you want to drive change from somebody, you got to get one simple concept in front of them that they can buy into. So I'd say that's been very helpful just to get the conversation of let's revisit this. But, that's why I always, my way of talking about retirement planning, as I say, is that moving target in the wind. Like the wind is going to continuously change things. We can't hope that the one plan we created 10, 15 years ago is going to make it through all the different things that change. There's a great, I didn't come up with this one, but it's the, if you're sailing, right? I can't right, control the direction or how hard the wind blows, but I can change the course of my sails, right? And that's really what we do in our planning is we change where our sails are facing, right? But I can't change the wind. And the wind was all of these changes, the Secure Act, the CARES Act, and now we need to change the course that we're going or we're going to get blown off course. And so revisiting that, just making sure we're not paying more taxes. I don't usually people don't like paying more taxes. So like if you say, hey, there was a plan change and this is going to require you to pay more taxes, I don't run into very many people that are like, I'd like to pay more taxes than I'm required to.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think, that I will look at that. And I think that might be helpful too, as we think about some of our current donors who may be in that situation and not really, how can we prompt them to take a look at this if they haven't already with their attorneys. As you say, if you see attorneys who are not right now reaching out to their clients and saying, hey, you need to take a look at this.
Yeah. Estate planning attorneys almost never reach back out to clients based off of rule changes, right? They tend to not have ongoing relationships. You usually go in, you get your documents, you get your plan, you leave, and that's kind of the end of the relationship. So they're not really the ones that we have to rely on for this change and review. We do have to rely on, right, as you said, the, charitable organizations saying, hey, this is a benefit. We need to rely on advisors and a lot of different things because the estate planning attorneys will deal with their new clients. They don't tend to reach back out to old clients on these.
Interesting. Thank you.
Great question, Kathy. Any other questions for Jamie?
It looked like Marlene was saying something, but you're still on mute. She's trying.
I got it.
There you go.
The IRA that I have is going directly to the beneficiaries, not to a trust. So the
Correct.
Secure Act would not touch that, would it?
So
The Secure Act
yeah, so
only has to do with the trust.
well, so it will now, when you probably first put those beneficiaries, the IRA used to spread over maybe your kid's life. Now it will be 10 years to be distributed. So it will be way shorter than it used to be. That's the change. So
Yeah, but if it goes to the trust, but if it goes directly to them?
Yep. Yeah. Even if it goes directly to them now, it is all moved now to 10 years.
10 years. All right.
Yep.
That's what I wanted. Yeah, that's what I was really curious about. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Marlene. Any other final questions? All right. Well, Jamie, I want to say thank you so much again for doing this. We really appreciate it. For any of our donors that are online right now or are seeing this in the recording in the future, I just want to say if any of this information has prompted you to think about your own charitable giving or your legacy planning, please feel free to reach out to the foundation. We are more than happy to work with you and your professional advisors. But other than that, I just want to leave one final thought here and just kick it over to our president, Kathy Kruchoff, to say a few words in closing for this session. Kathy?
Great. Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. As many of you know, and Marlene, maybe you don't know, I'm going to be retiring at the end of this year. And this usually we would have had some sort of event, but this year because of COVID, we weren't able to have our annual celebration or any of our usual donor get-togethers. So it's been a little difficult to say thank you and share how much I appreciate what you have done. I'm just so very appreciative of the relationships that I've had over the 12 years that I've been here. And want to wish you all the best. The foundation is in great shape. We've got a great staff here with Nick and his team on board, and just encourage you to continue to reach out to them. I'm looking forward to spending some more time in my flower bed and doing some things, but also continuing to stay active in Findlay. Marlene, I want to wish you all the best. I know it's been a tough year, but we're going to get through this. Dave, I know I'll see you around the neighborhood as you work on your son's house. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you and tell you how much I've appreciated getting to know you and work with you and help you build your legacy here at the Community Foundation. So with that, I'm going to say adios.
Thank you, Kathy, and the best to you too in retirement.
Thanks, Dave.
Great. Thanks for those final words, Kathy. We're going to miss you here, but we wish you well in your retirement. And with that, this is the end of the donor seminar. Just so everyone knows, we will be sending out the slideshow after this presentation's over. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to reach out to the Community Foundation. But I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And again, thanks, Jamie, for your presentation.
I don't